Buenas tardes a todos. Good afternoon, Mr. Ambassador.
Good afternoon.
See New Zealand as an extraordinary, albeit distant nation, full of natural wonders, good government, and an exceptional people, but very far removed from Mexico. And obviously, all that is true in a geographic sense. But over the past several decades, New Zealand has proven to be not only a guiding rod of the world over, but an exceedingly successful nation that we should all imitate. It is not only its economic reforms that showed the way since the beginning of the 1980s, or the exceptional management that they showed during the pandemic, but the quality of its people and government. It is a true pleasure to host you today, Ambassador Sinclair. Leonardo Curzio, our moderator, will introduce you. Let me just say a couple of words about him. Leonardo needs no introduction. He's not only an exceptional scholar, but Mexico's finest and more profound and knowledgeable communicator in both radio and television, as well as written word. It is an honor to have you both at COMEXI today. Leonardo, you have the floor or the Zoom. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa, kia ore, which means I'm very happy to be with you. Good afternoon, Ambassador. Good morning down there in Wellington. I should say that I miss scorching day. My dear Luis, allow me to say a quick comment before we start. I would like to acknowledge that you made a terrific work as president of COMEXI. Congratulations and thank you very much. So I'm deeply honored to share the panel with Ambassador Sinclair, of course. It's a very special occasion for me because you probably know I have a very special connection with New Zealand. I've been there several times. And once you experience New Zealand, you become a huge fan. You become an addict in a positive way, of course, but New Zealand could be an addiction. I would like to say that it's a beautiful country, as Luis said. New Zealand is an amazing social laboratory. It's a highly civilized country, and in the political fields, both in domestic and foreign policy, New Zealand has a lot of lessons to share with us. So I'm sure Ambassador Sinclair is going to enlighten us with his remarkable experience in Asia and all the Pacific Rim. And probably he's going to share with us some Kiwi secrets about how to improve governance and how to deal with the pandemic, or a piece of information to make it compatible the TPP and the new, this huge pact, trade pact, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. We are all very curious, Ambassador, to know more about your constructive pragmatism, about green recovery, and other equally interesting topics. We all know the program. I'm going to introduce you, Mr. Ambassador Sinclair. Then you will have the floor for 15 minutes, more or less. So we will have plenty of time for the discussion. So if you agree with me, I'm going to present some elements. I'm going to share with you some elements of the Ambassador Sinclair's impressive resume. Mark Sinclair is a graduate of the University of Auckland. Where else? He served for several years as foreign policy advisor to Prime Minister David Lynch. He is an expert in Asian affairs, and of course, he's a huge connoisseur of trade matters. He has been director of the Trade and Negotiation Division. He has been the New Zealand chief negotiator for the TPP. He has been appointed ambassador to Japan. He served as well as ambassador for climate change based on Wellington. And now we have the pleasure and the honor to have him as ambassador to Mexico. Ambassador Sinclair, the floor or the Zoom is yours.
Thank you. My thanks first of all to El Consejo Mexicano de Asuntos Internacionales for the opportunity to participate in this series of quarantine webinars. For me, it's first of all a great pleasure to be back in Mexico after 10 months in New Zealand. It's a very special honor to be introduced by your president, the very distinguished Dr. Luis Rubio, a big voice in fields of politics, diplomacy, and economics. And above all, I'm delighted to be part of a conversation with a great friend of New Zealand, Dr. Leonardo Curzio. And thank you for that very kind introduction. So first of all, why might a Mexican audience have an interest in hearing a New Zealand perspective on Asia? So perhaps I should start with the fact that for practical purposes, New Zealand, I think to a greater extent than Mexico, is very much a part of Asia. In an economic sense, for example, nearly 60% of our exports go to Asia, as against around 5%, I think, in the case of Mexico. 15% of our population is of Asian origin. 10% of our population is people who are actually born in one of the countries of Asia. And in the case of our biggest city, Auckland, it's a bit like Vancouver, around 30% of the population is of Asian origin. The day-to-day reality for me as a diplomat is that Asia and Asia-Pacific regional affairs dominate our diplomatic interests as well as our trade interests. Just in the last month, for example, our Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, has been awake at midnight and 1 o'clock in the morning participating in regional summits, such as the East Asia Summit that brings together leaders from the Association of Southeast Asian Nations and a group of North Asian capitals. She has been part of a summit meeting with the leaders of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and most recently the APEC summit, in which Mexico has also been a participant. New Zealand has just taken over as the host for 2021 of the APEC process. For the 10 months of this year that I spent back in Wellington as acting Deputy Secretary covering both Asia and the Americas, the issues that demanded most of my attention were those relating to China and Asian affairs. So a New Zealand perspective is one of a country that's very, very deeply involved in a range of Asian affairs. But I think the reason I was keen to take up the opportunity to have a conversation with COMEXI members today is that Mexico itself, whether government or business, also has a high and I think increasing level of interest in Asia. Your president, Mr. López Obrador, has from a very early stage advanced a strategy of diversification of Mexico's trade interests. I know that the Canciller, Mr. Ebrard, way back at the beginning of last year, 2019, declared his intention to redefine Mexico's foreign relationships, starting with Asia. And you know that he visited a number of Asian capitals, I think even before the change of administration. And in terms of what we do with Mexico, for New Zealand, the two great projects we have been involved in over the last 6 or 8 years, so TPP, and then the conversation between the Alianza del Pacifico and the Candidatos. Both of those were conceptually building blocks within an Asia strategy or an Asia-Pacific strategy, whether for New Zealand or for Mexico. So we have been partners in this, if you like, Asia-Pacific regional project, one that's been going on for decades, but one in which in recent years, Mexico and New Zealand have worked very closely together. That's a bit of the history. Alongside that, the reality of today in both countries is that we are facing a global pandemic, COVID-19, a pandemic that started in Asia, and a pandemic that has triggered a global economic crisis, which is causing immense damage, immense loss of life. So I think for both of us, economic recovery alongside the health of our peoples is a top priority, along with rebuilding international links. The irony is, although the pandemic started in Asia, I think for us at least, a key lesson of this year, 2020, has been that the key to recovery, to economic recovery, also is critically dependent on what we do in Asia and what we do with Asia. Let me just broaden the conversation a little. Why does Asia matter so much? Let me give you some numbers. Since we are the host of APEC this year, I'm going to use APEC numbers because that picks up the all the big economies in the Asia-Pacific region, and also includes, of course, Canada, the United States, Mexico, Peru, and Chile. So APEC, 21 economies, nearly 3 billion people. By 2030, the peoples of APEC will represent around 60% of the global middle class. Not just the population, 60% of the global middle class by 2030 will live in one of the APEC economies. APEC already represents 60% of global GDP. That's huge. It generates close to 50% of world trade. It has been a story of immense growth. The combined GDP, or PIB, of APEC has grown over the last 3 decades from 19 trillion US dollars to around 47 trillion United States dollars. Per capita income across these previously impoverished countries of Asia has increased by around 75%. And total trade within the group has increased 7 times. I know it's a cliche, but the reality today is that Asia is the engine of growth for the rest of the world. We can see evidence of the importance of this region in the rather ugly statistics for what's happening in the global economy this year. This year, I think the latest projections are for global GDP to drop around 4.5%. For the APEC region, that number will be around 2.5%. So a much smaller economic impact. And the projections are for more than 5% growth across the APEC region in 2021. There's a lot more we could talk about, the transformation of global supply chains, the place of China and so on. We could come back to that later on, perhaps in the question and answer session. One point above all I want to flag is that a key reason that the economic contraction in Asia and in the APEC region has been so small in 2020 is that the key economies of Asia, so China, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, have been comparatively very successful in controlling the pandemic. And that's had a big impact in minimizing the impact on economic growth. We have benefited immensely from that. We have largely been able to maintain our exports to Asia in the course of this year. And looking ahead, we expect exports to Asia and the eventual restoration of tourism and education links to be one of the key elements in rebuilding our economy in 2021. So that's why it matters. I just want to add 2 more things quickly before we get into a proper conversation. One is that the great structural changes that have put Asia, including China, at the heart of global production, global supply chains, global investment flows, global growth, that did not happen in a vacuum. The Asia region has enjoyed now decades of stability that's been helped by the evolution of regional institutions such as ASEAN, regional architecture, particularly trade architecture, such as the free trade agreements that New Zealand, Mexico, Japan, China, and others have joined. And not least, it's been helped by the role of the United States in providing confidence and an assurance of security in a region that up until the 1970s was extremely unstable. So the reason I flag this is that in a region where the interests of the great powers, so not just the United States and China, but Japan, Russia, Korea, and others, a region where those interests intersect, this stability is not something that can be taken for granted. I think you will understand that it goes without saying that the approach the next United States administration takes to the United States role in Asia and its role in diplomatic affairs, economic affairs, security affairs, will be a topic of immense interest for governments across the region, including obviously New Zealand and Mexico. And I'd be happy to come back to this later in the event. Second, although we are all preoccupied for obvious reasons with the pandemic and with the associated economic crisis, I think we are also starting to see an increasing sense of urgency around climate change. It's 5 years since the conclusion of the Paris Agreement, and yet it's just in recent weeks and months that we've seen public commitments from Japan, Korea, China to reach net carbon zero by middle of the century. New Zealand's government has just declared a climate change emergency. Australia's Prime Minister made some very important comments on climate change in a recent speech. But above all, I think we can expect the next United States administration to give top priority to climate action. Just to elaborate on that point, I think it's also highly likely that we'll start to see in the period ahead more of an alignment between strategies for economic recovery and strategies for climate action. So that long-standing cliche, green recovery, I think is set to become a thing, with a focus on using stimulus spending to drive economic recovery, using that stimulus spending to boost research and innovation, to boost clean energy, the development of the next generation of transport technologies, and the greening of investment flows, capital flows. So within this agenda, one reason I mention it in an Asia-Pacific context is that a key question will be the scope for renewed collaboration between the United States and China, with a view to rebuilding the partnership that was a key architectural element sitting underneath the conclusion of the Paris Agreement in 2005. And I know that Mexico was very closely involved in that process as well. I know it's a topic of high interest. So those are my introductory comments. There are other big questions I haven't really addressed. There's a lot of discussion at the moment around reshoring or restoring production capacity for critical supplies, such as health supplies, in response to the pandemic. There's talk about decoupling, which I think is driven primarily by strategic competition in the technology sector with the United States, China, Europe, among the key players. There have been some very, very interesting developments in China's own economic strategy and the evolution of China's economy. Trade architecture, I think, is always important. Apart from my personal interest in it, it's been an area where Mexico has played an immensely important role in in recent years, both under the current administration and under the administration of President Pena. And I think there's scope for a lot more to be done in the form of strategic economic diplomacy, trade and investment architecture, whether it's further development of the CPTPP agreement or something built on the Pacific Alliance, the Alliance of the Pacific, and so on. So, look, that's just a quick sketch of the things that are on my mind, Leonardo. I'm very happy to expand the conversation beyond that, but that's where we are at the moment.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Very interesting. I would like to start the conversation asking you a plain question. All this structure, APEC, the new partnership you have with all these countries in Asia, the CPTPP, are they compatible, or are we, I mean, making the same thing all time? Are they compatible?
Yeah, in practice, there's not a real problem. This came up a lot in the early days when we were negotiating TPP. And I was able to reassure people, based on New Zealand experience, that we had, for example, we already had before TPP, we already had 3 separate overlapping free trade agreements between New Zealand and Singapore. The bilateral deal from 1999, the P4 deal from 2004, and the Australia-New Zealand ASEAN deal, which I think was around 2006. And I won't go into the technicalities, but there are conventional ways of managing the differences between the market access and the rules in each of those agreements. So a proliferation of trade agreements isn't a problem. Ideally, with each new generation, we will see an improvement in the quality, as we've seen, for example, in the evolution from Teokan to TMEC between Mexico, the United States, and Canada.
So we can function with all these layers. Let me ask you a question about the United States. Are you expecting a turning point both in trade and the military strategy, the Pacific strategy of USA? You know, we all remember that the first decision made by Donald Trump administration was to quit the TPP and rebalance the military strategy. So are you expecting a turning point with the Biden ambassador?
Look, I think, we've got another 2 months under the current administration, and we only deal with one administration at a time. Like others, including Mexico, we've been watching very closely the public comments from the Democrats, including people around Mr. Biden. I think what we have been seeing is generally reassuring. I think some of it will have parallels with what we saw from the Obama administration, of which Mr. Biden and members of his team were a part. I think our impression is that in general we will see an orthodox approach to regional diplomacy. But I stress we are in wait and see moment. We won't be engaging with the new team in a formal way until after the change of administration.
I see. What about China? Everywhere you go, you find literature talking about or expressing the fear of a new Cold War or a commercial war. Is there a possibility, is there a path to build prosperity together in the Pacific Rim without this scenario of war between the two giants, Ambassador?
Well, I think the reality is that the big guys, at the end of the day, they need to deal with each other. I was just reading in El Economista, the latest US-China trade numbers. I mean, China remains the #1 trade partner of the United States. By some measures, I think there is about $400 billion of US investment in China, and heading for around $1 trillion of portfolio investment out of the United States in China. So these are not trivial numbers. They represent very substantial commercial interests, and we have seen, albeit with mixed success, sustained efforts by US administrations to work with China. As I said earlier, the Paris Agreement was founded on a political deal between the United States and China. I think there are other areas where we've seen public comments from the Democrats suggesting that issues such as nuclear proliferation, climate change, economic recovery are areas where there should be scope for engagement and hopefully success in working together. So that's our hope. We'll see how it plays out.
Yeah, I would like to ask you now about Mexico and New Zealand. Do we have a bilateral agenda, or we just share this region and all these projects? Do we have a specific bilateral agenda between our countries, Mr. Ambassador?
Well, in my first year or so here, we were very focused on the implementation of the new CPTPP agreement.
You were the chief negotiator, man.
Yeah. That's been huge in terms of new opportunities for trade and investment. We saw, for example, a big surge in exports of Mexican autos to New Zealand. I think partly because of TPP, partly because automobile manufacture stopped in Australia. So there was a reconfiguration of multinational supply chains. But we've also seen some interesting developments in investment. We've got a very successful major medical product company, Fisher & Paykel in Tijuana, which has been delivering huge increases in production in response to the COVID pandemic. Meanwhile, we've seen a very big Mexican investment in New Zealand of nearly $1 billion. That was done by Finaxis Capital, the former Grupo Modelo shareholders led by Carlos Fernandez. So I think, these days, as you know, trade is often directly linked to investment. This, I think, is the start of something good on the investment front. We're keen to see that develop further because Mexican investment in New Zealand has lots of potential and will be very welcome. Beyond that, I guess the general comment I would make, and this is something we might want to take up with the new Secretary of the Economy, is that at the moment we have two governments which have quite a strong political alignment. They look at economic performance, not just in terms of GDP, but well-being, bienestar. Yeah. They have an interest in making sure that globalization can be made to work for every group in society, including women, including indigenous groups. They have an interest in tackling inequality. So I think there is still a lot of upside potential for doing good things together, not just the hard-edged trade stuff, if you like.
Scientific cooperation, I guess. But when you go to certain restaurants in New Zealand, Ambassador, it's not unusual that the waitress are Spanish-speaking. You find a lot of Chileans, Peruvians, you find a lot of French as well, but they don't speak Spanish. But they are proud to be members of this program. How do you call it? Working holiday visa. Are you considering expanding this program to Mexico?
Normally, we will only expand working holiday scheme numbers in the context of a new trade negotiation. So we would probably be able to have a good conversation if we were able to upgrade the market access provisions of TPP in areas such as lácteos. But But yes, you're quite right. My last restaurant meal, my waitress was from Brazil, and she was a great waitress. But
Great waitress.
I've got no Portuguese, so that wasn't much help.
Yeah. And what about a direct flight?
At the moment, Air New Zealand has suspended almost all of its international flights, including the Buenos Aires service. So I don't know what the chances are. I think it will take quite some time for services to rebuild. But up until the arrival of the pandemic, we had great options. We had services through Houston, Chicago,
Los Angeles and San
Francisco and Los Angeles. So there were 4 good options.
You have
or
7
5 actually, including Vancouver. Yeah.
Yeah, and tell us a little bit more about the RSEP before we go to the New Zealand politics. Is there an open door for India? It's interesting that India is, I mean, part of the region. Tell us a little bit more about this impressive, humongous trade pact that you have already signed.
Well, yeah, humongous is the word. I mean, with RCEP, as we call it, we're talking 15 economies, 1/3 of the world's population, about half of New Zealand's exports, a combined GDP of around $25 trillion, which is around 30% of global GDP. For us, it's not a big thing in terms of new market access, but it's very important on the, if you like, the trade facilitation things, so technical areas such as customs procedures and rules of origin, which really matter to exporters. So as a piece of architecture, it's really important. As a signal in support of rules-based trade, it's very important at a time when
strategic landscape. No?
Yeah. It's a rejection, if you like, of protectionism. India, I don't know, the politics of trade for India are really difficult, always have been, and yet India is emerging as a big player in services, in technology, and in investment. So we will persevere, but whether they will come back to RCEP anytime soon, I just don't know.
We have some questions. Luis Rubio is asking, Australia, your closest neighbor, is in the midst of a fight with China. How important is China for New Zealand, and how vulnerable are you to its potential extortion, Ambassador?
So China is easily our biggest market. It's also a critical supplier of imports for New Zealand. So we have reasonably balanced trade. We were the first Western country to do a free trade deal with China back in 2008. And we followed up with trade agreements with the other 2 Chinas, with Hong Kong and then with Taiwan, which was a rather unique diplomatic achievement. I guess you could say that we are a bit exposed because we have quite a high level of dependence on the Chinese market for some things, but it works both ways. I mean, we supply more than half of China's imports of dairy products. Chinese consumers and processors value the quality of what we supply. And we have let's say, a very practical diplomatic relationship. China can be quite outspoken and very direct in its comments, as you know. We're the smaller partner, but we've made it clear to China that if we have a disagreement on questions of policy, we may want to say so publicly. And so far, we have managed to manage that relationship without any particular impacts on our bilateral trade.
Yeah. Chris Mazur, hi. Your Prime Minister, tell us about your Prime Minister, is nowadays not just a political celebrity in New Zealand, she's a universal political celebrity. We all know that she won the elections and she's a mother of a beautiful baby, Niamh, which is beautiful. I mean, it's a beautiful story. She had an outstanding performance dealing with the Christchurch terrorist attack, and she has been praised during the pandemic. Tell us about her. Is she moderate? in terms of labor terms, is she like Jeremy Corbyn or more close to Tony Blair, or she closer to, I mean, I don't know, Biden, for instance, or Bernie Sanders? Tell us about your prime minister, Ambassador.
Well, I hesitate to speak for her on her political positioning, but I think she would say she, has a progressive political agenda. She's certainly very much the leader of the Labour Party, which is a centre-left party in New Zealand terms. I guess for me, a big takeaway of experience over this year as the government has wrestled with the pandemic has been the very focused approach and the very practical approach taken by the Prime Minister and the other ministers involved. For an extended period during the height of the pandemic, the Prime Minister was doing a daily press conference to provide a public update. And it became clear from those press conferences that she had immersed herself very deeply in the detail of outbreaks of the epidemic, the individual clusters, individual cases, the means of transmission, the policies that were proving effective or not so effective, the issues that we were facing in maintaining quarantine at the border, and so on. So I guess our experience this year, ultimately in having reasonable success in managing the pandemic, has been the importance of that intensely focused, practical approach based on science and expert advice. Helped, I think, in our case by the fact that we have a fairly small population. We are an island, so we don't have a border with other countries. We have only a single House of Parliament. We don't have a federal system.
You have a biosecurity perimeter.
We do.
Which is absolutely impressive, Ambassador.
Very strict, yeah. But anyway, we've been fortunate in some respects, but I think also we've been smart in other respects in the way we've gone about it. And the leadership from Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern has been a key factor in that, and that I think was recognised by the public in the election outcome.
And what about the anti-terrorism strategy?
Yes, look, that was traumatic for us in New Zealand because we've never believed that we could be a target for terrorism in that way. So it was quite a hard lesson for us in the realities of the modern world. In fact, it was only a few months after that, I think, in August of last year, that we saw the El Paso attacks directed against a Mexican. So we have felt a very strong sense of solidarity around that. We've just released the results of an inquiry into the terrorist attack in Christchurch, and the Prime Minister has spoken about some of the things that she plans to do in response to the findings of the inquiry. The key ones, I think, are a continuing emphasis on social cohesion in New Zealand. A recognition that every person, every ethnic group in our country matters, that it's our collective responsibility as a people to cherish and support them, and to have policies that recognise the value of diversity and making every person feel that they matter at the top level of politics.
It's interesting. I have a two short question about your foreign policy. You have a very interesting concept called constructive pragmatism. What is this about?
Well, if you're a country of 5 million people, as we are, you don't have any power or leverage. You have to deal with the world as it is rather than how you might want it to be. especially when you're dealing with the big guys. I think Mexico probably has a lot of expertise in this area as well, given your long experience of working with your big neighbor to the north. But yeah, we have one advantage in that often in international processes, we can step aside from the New Zealand national interest and operate as, if you like, as a friend of the process. During the climate change process that led up to the Paris Agreement, for example, we tried to work on the architecture on that without real regard to the narrow New Zealand interest. So that's the principle, being practical and being able to pursue the larger collective interest on occasion rather than the narrow New Zealand national interest.
You have a huge potential in soft power, far from the, how do you call it, Lord of the Rings. Your movies, you have a lot of creativity, you have a lot of soft power. Tell us about your strategy. What are you doing with this enormous charisma that New Zealand has?
Well, first, I think I would say sometimes it's good not to have a strategy. I mean, if anyone had said to me 30 years ago that New Zealand was going to have a Hollywood-style film industry making huge hits,
quite successful, by the way.
Well, yeah, but it's not something that was the product of a strategy. It was an accident, if you like, built on the creativity and entrepreneurship of Peter Jackson. And I guess where we do have a strategy is in maintaining a business environment that supports innovation and creativity. I'll give you another example. Last year, we launched for the first time a Mexican satellite into space. This was the result of a new space program that was the result of an initiative by a very creative New Zealand engineer. We now have a company that's launching rockets every month or two from New Zealand, and it's now the world leader in launching small satellites. Again, that's not the product of a government strategy, but it is the product of a
social creativity,
a culture and a business environment that encourages innovation. As for soft power, well, a lot of it comes down to making ourselves useful, working with other countries. So if you like, collaborating with Mexico in something like TPP or in nuclear proliferation initiatives or human rights issues in the United Nations. That's where we can make ourselves very useful.
You are, of course, a reliable partner in the multi-lateral arena, but you are excellent rugby players. I myself have the All Blacks jersey. I have the Hurricanes.
Oh, good.
As well. So rugby is a very good, sport. It's a very interesting part of your soft power, Ambassador.
Yeah, unfortunately, it doesn't extend so far to football. So I don't think we're going to be.
But you're becoming more and more popular with the rugby.
Well, it is. We've had a few Mexicans, young players playing in New Zealand at a developmental stage. But as soon as they get any good, they go off to Europe and join one of the professional clubs there.
Yeah, I have a couple of questions from our the audience. Fernando de Mateo is asking, in your opinion, what are the odds that China would join the CPTPP, the US both?
I should first of all say hello to my good friend Fernando. I can't see him on the screen, but great to know he's
he should be there, huh?
hanging in there. The risk now that he's spotted me back in Mexico is that he'll want me for the Colegio de Mexico. But anyway, the possibility of China in TPP. What's really interesting is that whereas 10 years ago, it was basically just the Chinese Commerce Ministry that was interested in TPP. It's now a joined up position from MOFCOM and from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I've just seen a message on screen from Fernando. Where it will lead, I don't know. I need to be a bit careful what I say, but I think a lot of the speculation will be that this is a tactical ploy by China, partly motivated by an interest in sending signals to the next United States administration on options for managing trade tensions with the United States. The related point, I suppose, is that we have seen over the years parts of the Chinese system interested in using international trade processes to drive necessary economic reform inside China itself. That was certainly the driver of China's accession to the WTO, and it may be a factor in their signaling on TPP. But at the end of the day, I don't think I want to give Fernando a straight answer on that. I simply don't know. And we've had conversations with China, but their motives are still a little mysterious.
Armando Vargas is asking you, how does New Zealand looks the Central American integration system, Ambassador?
We feel somewhat remote from it, and we don't bring to Central American diplomacy anything like the resources that countries of Europe and elsewhere in the Americas offer. To the extent that we have focused on it, our interest has been whether there are aspects of the New Zealand rural development model and the indigenous development model that might be relevant. For example, we have been exploring a little project in Yucatan that could also be relevant across the border in Guatemala around the commercialization of miel de melipona, which is an extraordinary honey, but which is sold as a commodity instead of being commercialized and sold as a premium product. There is the potential there to transform the ganancias, the returns for the indigenous women who actually produce that honey. I think likewise the New Zealand.
What's the name of your premium honey? Hanuka?
Manuka. Yeah. So there are things like that, and likewise our model of livestock production, our ganaderia, based on pasture rather than grain production, I think has been very successful for us in international markets. I think it might have some relevance in the south of Mexico and across the border.
Central America.
Central America, yeah.
Interesting. Gerardo Velasquez would like to know about the daily role of the indigenous population in New Zealand, as well their involvement in political issues, Ambassador.
Well, our new parliament has, I think, a larger number of indigenous Maori members of parliament than ever before. Andrew might be able to correct me. I think it might be 9 altogether. Our new Minister of Foreign Affairs is a Maori woman who has an indigenous Maori moko or tatuahe on her chin. Our new Defence Minister is Maori, and there are others in senior positions in the cabinet. So they have political weight. Maori tribes are increasingly important in the economy, particularly the export economy. They're big producers of seafood, timber, of kiwi fruit, of meat and dairy. we still have lots of, there are still lots of challenges that go back to the impacts of colonialization, but not only is the Maori economy important, I think the role of commitments made during the colonial era is increasingly important within our constitutional arrangements, which is a rather unique feature, I think, of New Zealand society today.
Well, Ambassador, we are running out of time. I would like to thank you for this opportunity. Ha sido un placer, embajador, poder moderar esta conversación. Y ahora le pido a nuestra directora de COMEXI que nos haga la presentación final y la despedida, los últimos comentarios. Verónica Ortiz, muchas gracias también por la invitación. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And we look forward to seeing visitors from Mexico back in New Zealand once flights resume, hopefully sometime in 2021. So thank you again to Leonardo, Luis Rubio,
thank you, Ambassador.
Friends in COMEXI, and all of those who have participated today. Buena tarde.
Verónica.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ambassador Sinclair and Leonardo Curzio, for this very enlightening conversation on the views of New Zealand regarding health, economic, geopolitics, and the potential for our mutual and bilateral relationship. We will have the video of this conversation available on our website shortly, where you are invited to see this and the other quarantine webinars that we've been holding throughout the year. On behalf of COMEXI, Chairman Luis Rubio and its board, we appreciate having Ambassador Sinclair with us this afternoon and this morning to you in New Zealand. And most of all, we appreciate and value having the Embassy of New Zealand as our valued member. Thank you very much again. Good afternoon in Mexico. Good day. Good afternoon to you in New Zealand. Thank you again, Ambassador Sinclair, Leonardo Curzio.
Thank you all very much.